Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 228, The Cannabis Rabbi. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here today with another guest with whom we're going to use as a jumping off point some of the interesting connections between Judaism and psychoactive substances of various kinds. A few weeks ago, we had Zach Kamenetz talking about his adventures in the Johns Hopkins experiment on clergy and psychedelics and where he's been taking that. And today, our guest, James Kahn, is involved in the cannabis industry. James Kahn is the National Outreach Director for Holistic Industries, one of the nation's largest privately held multi-state cannabis operators, and he is a rabbi. Holistic Industries is among the largest privately held multi-state cannabis operators in the United States. As a vertically integrated company, it oversees the entire process of getting cannabis to market, including cultivation, manufacturing, processing, packaging, transporting, and eventually distributing cannabis to dispensaries across the country. At Holistic Industries, James Kahn is responsible for creating and implementing its corporate responsibility platform called Liberty Cannabis Cares, a collection of initiatives focused around social equity, diversity, cannabis literacy, and community outreach. His work in cannabis began in 2012 when he and his family opened Tacoma Wellness Center, DC's first family-owned and operated medical cannabis dispensary. His stores have been recipients of Americans for Safe Access's patient-focused certification. James Kahn has rabbinic ordination from the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College in the Boston area, and he previously served as senior Jewish educator at the University of Maryland Hillel and director of chaplaincy and Jewish engagement at JSSA, the Jewish social service agency serving Greater Washington. From 2012 to 2017, he worked as rabbinic director for Washington, D.C.'s Hebrew Free Burial Society and led the Washington Board of Rabbis. James Kahn, great to have you on Judaism Unbound. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's an honor, and it's a heck of a lot of fun to get to speak to some friends, about this topic.
And I should say that, James, we're old friends from time where we spent in the Hillel world, and it's interesting. I mean, I think that we've both taken interesting directions since then. So I think it would be really interesting to understand a little bit. How did you, as a rabbi, get into the cannabis business? And specifically, I know that it started as a family business, and your dad is also a rabbi. So it would be very interesting to hear the story of how your family, this rabbinic family, got into this business.
It's our dynasty. Yeah. So it actually began with my grandfather. Actually, the very first person who ever scored pot for was my grandpa. I was 14 years old. My grandfather, he had severe MS the whole time I knew him. I think he was diagnosed at the age of 35. And before that, he was, 1950s man's man, a real estate agent who flew to the Bahamas from Miami every day, selling real estate. He was at the top of his game. And within 5 years of being at the top of his game, he was basically paralyzed for all intents and purposes, and bedbound from the age of 40 onward. So he experienced an incredible amount of pain and depression related to his MS, and he tried everything to find some relief. At one point, I'd like to, as an extreme example of how far the family went to try to help my grandfather, is that in the 1970s, he tried injecting snake venom, which was, I guess, thought to provide some relief from neuropathic pain. It did not, but we kept trying more things. And by the time I knew him, he had been through an incredible addiction to opiates. And it just so happened that one of the aides that worked with him recommended cannabis and gave him some, and it worked. I mean, cannabis doesn't always work for everybody. And there's people that come into our stores that have high hopes and it doesn't work. But for my grandfather, his spasticity issues ceased. His neuropathic pain stopped. And for a few hours, the guy had relief that he had not felt in years. And I one time found a bong when I was a kid, staying home from school sick. My parents dropped me at their place, and I found a bong. Doesn't look like any bong I had ever seen. Or I have ever seen it actually attached to the wall so that he could wheel up to it and use it while my grandmother was at work. So that was kind of my taste, my first introduction to cannabis, to medical cannabis. And really that his story transformed my family story. My mom was a nurse, but worked in drug and alcohol treatment centers most of her career. I grew up with bumper stickers on our car that said "Hugs, not drugs." But when it's personal, it's personal. And my mom saw eventually it became clear that it was helping my grandfather, and they turned their social justice energy, which they had a lot of. My father really fit that motif of a social justice reform rabbi, a tikkun olam champion. And, he turned that energy towards getting access for medical cannabis and became a voice, used his rabbinic voice to be heard. But he eventually became the director of the Interfaith Drug Alliance, something like initiative, which tried to garner interfaith support for progressive drug policy and, the end of mandatory minimums, the end of incarceration over treatment. So that when you walk into my parents' store in DC, the first thing you see is a picture of my grandparents. And really, my family wanted to create a dispensary that would have been a place where my grandfather would have felt comfortable going. Just a place that was focused on the plant as medicine, as a tool for wellness, and education and advocacy.
So this is about a decade ago, and your dad, prior to this, is a congregational rabbi?
30 years.
And so what's actually the story? Like, how did he navigate? Did he leave his congregation? Was he doing this as a side gig? How did that work?
He did the circuit, the Reformed circuit. So he was a great example of graduating rabbinical school, and your two options were every congregation had a specific size, and it was attached to a letter, an A size, a B size, D, E. And you couldn't just go from rabbinical school to an E. You could go to an A, or you could go to a C, but with a senior rabbi there, you could be the junior rabbi. So he was not great at playing with others. Always, he did not want to be the junior rabbi to some senior rabbi. So he graduated rabbinical school and went to Adelaide, Australia, which had never seen a Reform rabbi before. And he was one of the first progressive rabbis in southeastern Australia. And so he did that for 5 years and then graduated to being able to access bigger shuls with probably bigger paychecks and eventually moved all the way up and at the end was running a rather large synagogue in New Jersey and really became, I would say, pretty burnt out. He had given over his Torah and what he had to give. And I think he was burned out on pulpit life, honestly. And so at one point they said enough and they had some money and they moved to Israel. And that was right before the crash, the big real estate crash. And so they bought a house in Israel and eventually they stayed in Israel for a while, ran out of money. We had kids, my wife and I, and they said they wanted to be closer to them. And so they sold their place in Israel. It was one of the few places that escaped the housing bubble and came back to DC with some money. And it just so happened, this is somewhat, I think, interesting. DC is one of the only places in America that's, has no representation, right, in Congress, or at least no official representation. And DC residents had passed a law 10 years earlier allowing medical marijuana to exist in DC. Congress had put a 10-year moratorium on that law, forcing it not to come into existence. That moratorium expired under Obama and a Democratic Congress. And all of a sudden, one day, DC had medical marijuana, like as if it was, nobody had to vote on it. It was over. It was 10 years ago. And so all of a sudden, DC had to create a program. And I really think that almost no other place, knowing how hard it is to get these licenses, my family would have received a license. But in DC was so unique because the eyes of the world were on it, that they really wanted, I think, to give licenses to people that would really represent the values at the heart of the program. And so giving it to a nurse and a rabbi, it worked. And despite being up against some rather large, big competition and some big corporate players, They're the biggest and best dispensary in DC. They're one of the most successful dispensaries in the country. And they really have shown, that authenticity and heart are what matters most in this business. And really, especially since, and really decrease the stigma and stereotype of who goes to a dispensary.
So it's funny, before we came on the show, and sorry if I'm stealing any of your thunder, Lex, Lex remarked that your name was James Kahn, and that's the name of the actor who played Sonny Corleone. But I'm thinking a little bit of Michael Corleone, because basically you were pulled back into the family business. You tried to go legit, but you were pulled into the family business. And what's interesting is that you actually went into both family businesses. I mean, first you tried to, go legit by becoming a rabbi. Well, I guess that was before the other was the family business. And then you were a rabbi in all kinds of you weren't a congregational rabbi, so you were already a rabbi in, let's say, less traditional contexts, Hillel and other things. And but then you kind of came into the family business. So tell us a little bit about that story, and both what were you trying to do as a rabbi before your family got into the cannabis business, and then how did you eventually come into the business?
So I was looking for my own path. I ended up doing a bunch of different things. At one point, I was an EMT. After 9/11, I was trying to give back, and I really loved the education, and I thought maybe I wanted to go to medical school. And I did start medical school for a couple of weeks, and then I realized it was just not for me. And I was sitting in a chemistry course, which I did not belong in. And my wife came to see what I was up to. She was my girlfriend at the time. And she was reading God is a Verb by Rabbi David Cooper. And I'm looking at her, and then I'm looking back at my paper, and I'm listening to my teacher, and I'm looking at her, and I'm looking at my paper. And I said, what if I'm going to be stuck in a room for the next 5 years studying something? I want to be reading that. That's what I want to be studying. And it just was so crystal clear to me that we didn't even finish the course. I tapped her on the shoulder, I told her to follow me out, and I withdrew from Rutgers program that day, and wrote letters to rabbinical schools saying I was interested and can I come interview? And I had this really interesting experience because I wasn't in any way connected to a denomination that I felt pulled to go to one denominational institution over another. So I had grown up in the Reform movement. I was certainly attached to it. It seemed like the best idea professionally as far as raising a family, and there's good jobs. At the time, I really thought it was a secure move. But then I actually came and fell in love with Judaism as a college student through the conservative movement. And my Yiddishkeit came from the Aleph renewal movement from Zalman, and working at Eilat Chaim, which was the old Jewish retreat center in New Paltz, New York. And I just was Jewish. I just was hungry for meaningful Judaism wherever I could find it. So that's how broad what I was looking at. And wherever I went, they really wanted me to, I remember applying to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical School and having my preliminary interview. And at the end, the person said, you're a great candidate, and I think you'd be great here. But take this book, Exploring Reconstructionist Judaism. And when you come for your official interview, be able to explain to us why you want to be a Reconstructionist rabbi. And I was so honestly turned off by that, in a sense of I wasn't looking to I just wanted to become a rabbi. I didn't know enough to choose a denomination. I wasn't there. I just wanted to study Judaism. And it really wasn't until I got to Hebrew College that I realized I could go to rabbinical school. I got pretty despondent after interviewing at a lot of places and thinking that there just was no place for me. And then I went to Hebrew College, and I interviewed with Art Green and a few other wonderful souls. And I was just honest with them about my Jewish life, about the questions I had, about the doubt I had, about why, all the reasons maybe I'm not such a good rabbinical student. And, they didn't flinch. And I received the invitation to join the school within 48 hours.
Yeah. So I want to dive deeper into a few things. One, I want to talk way more about the idea of what's a rabbi, because in a few ways that's come up with your family and with your own journey. And I want to do so not as a departure from talking about cannabis, but actually as a continuation of it, because I think there's an interesting thing, at least from my perspective, where I look at the relationship of authority or society, traditional society, to marijuana over the years, which is to say, like, this is a dangerous thing. It's a risky thing. It's a countercultural thing. It goes against the norms of society. Like, I look at that, and it actually deeply resembles to me the relationship of, historically, the institution of the rabbi with most Jews. Like, don't do the risky side thing. Like, we've got sort of our rules and regulations and all this strange folk stuff you might be doing on the side. I don't know about that. Like, we're not going to really enshrine that. And what's interesting is, you know, what we're seeing in American society, at least, Canada being a little ahead, actually, and around the world, is that eventually enough can happen where those norms change. And, like, it's not the case today in 2020 that I don't think it is seen as much as, like, this big countercultural thing for somebody to smoke weed as it once was. I think there's a real change happening there. And I think that what that opens up for me is, oh, what if we learned from that as people who want to be transforming Judaism and said, a lot of the ways in which we're being so nervous, so restrictive about how X, Y, or Z change, some new practice to Judaism could, like, be a threat in the same ways that drugs were seen as a threat, and drug war, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what if there's actually a huge opportunity here? And so, like, I guess I'm curious to hear your take on that. Like, on the one hand, I think people could look at you, like Dan even said this, you know, you've got two family businesses, right? You've got the rabbi side and the cannabis side. But I guess what I'm getting at is, are they actually one family business? Like, is there actually a way in which these are the same and where we should be taking the lessons from each and sort of applying them? And I guess the direction I'm most interested in is taking the lessons from cannabis and applying it to Judaism, as, you know, we are Judaism Unbound, but I'm curious in both directions.
First of all, the fact that it's not so countercultural to smoke pot anymore is, it's not just not countercultural. Cannabis is considered essential. Pennsylvania called it a life-sustaining activity. You know, if in the middle of one of the worst pandemics the world has seen, the governments have taken meaningful action to protect our access to food and to pot. Like, what?
Yeah.
That's crazy. And so, if anything, it shows just how profound change can happen, how quickly and how deeply change can happen. You know, we went from reefer madness in the 1930s to cannabis as essential. And even 7 years ago, when my family first got in this business, I was so embarrassed. I remember just being embarrassed to talk about what they were up to. And this was even just when they were applying for the license. And did I tell people? And I was working at Hillel. I mean, this was a safe place. You know, the students only thought I was cooler. And now, you know, I don't feel that. So that's just a reminder to us of how quickly things can change, and what can at one point seem so dramatic and scary can be so normal. The sky did not fall. And I think the same thing, you know, about Judaism, this whole fear-based rabbinate. I think, if anything, Hebrew College taught me not to worry about the future of Judaism. What was going to help was worrying about a Judaism that mattered in this moment, and the future will take care of itself. If Judaism doesn't survive, I don't know. I can't believe that's a rabbit hole I don't like to go down, but it has never been an inspiring part of my rabbinate to think, you know, I need to somehow save us from Hitler or save us from a Judaism that's disappearing.
Yeah, I guess what I'm curious about is going back to that. Like, are there ways in which these two family businesses are one? Are there ways in which, and if I'm pushing too hard and the answer is, like, you do see them as separate, I'm interested in that too. But, like, mostly I think that when people would see, oh, there's like a Judaism Unbound episode with cannabis in the title, I feel like they might see that as, like, oh, we're doing some, like, we're trying to be edgy or we're trying to be interesting. But, like, I actually think that this is a very demonstrably important part of Jewish society. It's not somehow that when people smoke weed, they're like putting their Judaism aside for the moment and doing something else, and then maybe they'll go back. We all know lots, maybe not we all, but a lot of us know many Jews who regularly imbibe. And I don't know that that's seen as like, they're taking on a sacred practice, right? So I guess I'm curious if you see ways in which the cannabis work that you do is an extension or a relation in relation to Jewish practice, you as a rabbi, et cetera.
Absolutely. I mean, people ask me all the time, are you still a rabbi? And, my response is usually, well, nobody's kicked me out, and I don't think they're going to. And it really makes me think of, when did I start becoming a rabbi? Was it really just with smicha? But no, because in smicha, and I mean ordination, and when I finished and I turned in my final paper, and my teachers, heard my final spiel and laid hands on me and decided the community could rely on me. When I think back to like when I became a rabbi, it was at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Boston. And there was a rabbi chaplain at Beth Israel who, for what it was had just died, I believe. My memory serves me, and just died. So they were all they had was me and one other rabbinical school student. As the third year rabbinical school students, we were the only Jewish quote unquote professionals in the building. And somebody I got a call. I went down to the ER. There was a guy there who had emergency surgery a year or two ago. And in the midst of that surgery his heart had stopped and basically had kind of been declared dead, but then revived and had come back and had to have that emergency surgery again in like 2 hours. Like, they had to do it. And he wanted to see a rabbi, not a religious guy. He taught at Harvard. And he was there with his fiance, and he came and he asked, and he said to me, I could die today. And I don't want to die not married to this person that I love. Will you do the wedding? And I said, yeah. And I literally had my rabbinic manual on me. And anyone who's ever seen one of these, I don't remember which, it was from the conservative movement, the little black book. In it, there's a ketubot.
A different kind of little black book.
Yeah, a little different, very different. And in the book, there's like a sample ketubah, which is the Jewish wedding contract. And, it's a sample one with lines where it's showing you this is where you put the groom's name and the name of the bride and whatever. And I literally cut them out and filled in these people's names in the sample ketubah. And we used that as the ketubah. And I found I found witnesses amongst the staff, the doctors in the ER. We found 2 Jews, and I did a wedding. My first wedding was in the ER of a hospital, and they needed me to be a rabbi. I was a rabbi, a full-on rabbi. I wasn't a rabbinical student to them. I was a rabbi because they needed me to be a rabbi. And that's where I became a rabbi. What I found is it's the privilege of being a rabbi is that people want rabbis. But I mean, we're lucky. We haven't been, for the most part. Sometimes there's people that's terrible experiences, but for the people that I meet, being a rabbi means they can tell me something that they have been wanting to tell somebody for a while now, and they haven't had a chance, or they haven't felt comfortable, or they have an idea, or they just lost somebody. Or they're just struggling and they want to share that. It's so profound, the doors it unlocks in the human spirit, and the ability it gives me to connect with another human being. So I don't think I can turn that off any more than I turned it on. So what does it mean to be a rabbi? It certainly doesn't mean just knowing a bunch of stuff about Judaism, because there's people. I have teachers that that's saying forget in one day everything I've known my entire life about being Jewish. People can go to Wikipedia and look up Jewish history. Being a rabbi to me is being part of making meaning out of life. It's fighting against suffering. It's becoming a blessing. So in cannabis, how am I a rabbi in cannabis? I guess. I always think rabbis have a superpower that's the least impressive superpower to every child that I've ever told it to. But I can normalize things. I can talk about things like cannabis and destigmatize it. I remember my mentor in rabbinical school. He had been at the same shul for decades, and he was on the verge of retiring, and he finally felt comfortable enough to give a Yom Kippur sermon where he admitted to his own struggle with depression. And I don't remember the sermon, but it's something that started like, he was the happiest guy. Like, you meet this guy and he was just jovial and made you feel good. And you would never imagine he had any issues of being happy. And his sermon started with like, happiness has been hard won in my life. And it turned out what helped him get there was an SSRI. And I can't tell you how radical that was at the time for him to say aloud. He must have been wondering, is this my last year here? Does somehow that could make you weaker in the rabbinate. At my work at the Jewish Social Service Agency, a lot of it revolves around chaplaincy, around educating rabbis about how to speak about mental illness and loss, and that their personal struggles as a way of, if you can't do it, what does that say to your congregants?
Can we talk a little bit about cannabis in particular? And, maybe it's a question about cannabis and the future of Judaism, or maybe it's a question about something slightly different from that. But I'm thinking about a few different elements of it. One is that in a previous conversation, you told me that there are a lot of Jews involved in the cannabis industry, and I'm interested in that. Why is that? What's going on there? I'm also wondering, though, like, if we think about cannabis as part of Judaism, I think this is partly what Lex was asking about earlier, is that how could we imagine cannabis as a more as actually a part of Judaism, as opposed to some kind of secret thing that people do and everybody does it and whatever, doesn't really talk, but it's like, it has nothing to do with Judaism. And I guess I'm wondering on at least two levels, some of which harken back to our conversation with Zach Kamenetz a few weeks ago. One is this possibility that somehow the religious experience was designed by people who have had these elevated spiritual experiences, whether they took psychedelics or they meditated or they did something that most people can't do. And then they try to come back and find a way to help people get some version of those experiences. What do we do in a time when actually people can do the primary experience? And how might that change religion or a wisdom tradition? And then the other piece is how cannabis or how anything of that nature like is reintegrated into something like Judaism, because I'm also thinking about the possibility that there are things that other religions, let's say, might see as a vice or as something kind of not that great, like sex, for example, that Judaism says, okay, well, we're going to have a different attitude about it. We're going to say that we're going to find ways to elevate it and to, there may be certain restrictions. There may, Judaism hasn't always done great with sex, but I mean, as an example of something that it says, well, other peoples might look at this and say, this is dirty. This is not something that we should be involved with. And Judaism says, no, we should be involved with it. And
this too is Torah.
Me wonder, like, this too is Torah. It's a story in the Talmud about it. Somebody that was hiding under the bed of his rabbi to see how he had sex, and then when the rabbi caught him, he said, "But this is too is Torah, and I have to learn about it." And that's an interesting. I mean, that guy was, I would say, very smart at coming up with an excuse. But
it's that they kept it. It's that they kept it. That
yeah, you're exactly
that could
right.
have been just a story. Right. It's that they kept that.
Right.
That's profound. That was cool.
Right. But with cannabis, like, I wonder what it might look like to say that, not only it's more than legalization, right? It's saying, and it's not only about Judaism, right? It may be about the society more broadly. It's saying, like, what about a different attitude where we say, no, this is actually a good thing, like you were talking about earlier, that we need this during the social distancing time. So what would it look like to actually take something that in the past had been seen as a vice or negative and actually say, no, we actually can find a way to make this sacred, and that'll mean that it's different from when you just smoke it at home in your backyard. It's going to be different. And I'm a little bit thinking about that recent archaeological discovery where they found cannabis resin in a ancient Jewish temple of some kind. And so can you talk about, like, if you were sort of if you were doing the kind of work that we do on a daily basis, which is kind of try to rethink Judaism in various ways, I'm curious, like, how you might put the question of cannabis into play.
The first person to point out to me how many people are Jewish that are involved in the cannabis industry was Richard Nixon. I don't know if you've heard his famous quote, but I'll read it to you.
Yes, indeed. We'll put it in the show notes on the website too.
Well, he said, Bob, what was his last name?
Haldeman.
Bob, it's a funny thing. Every one of the bastards that are out there for legalizing marijuana is Jewish. That's Nixon. Okay, he says, what's the Christ is the matter with the Jews, Bob? What is the matter with them? I suppose it's because most of them are psychiatrists. I love that quote so much. What the Christ, what the hell is the matter with us Jews, and why are we so? And why is Israel? For those of you who don't know, Israel is the center of the medical cannabis world. The guy who discovered THC, the main psychoactive cannabinoid in marijuana, is Professor Meshulam at Hebrew University. The largest cannabis farm in Israel is called Tikkun Olam Farms. Israel produces some of the greatest strains of medical cannabis that are dialed in specifically to meet to help with specific symptoms of a variety of illnesses. So we could probably spend an entire session just wondering aloud why. I like to think of Jews as there's actually maybe Lex, you'll know the name of the rabbi, the way of the boundary crosser.
You're talking about the Ivrim? You're talking
Ivrim,
about the idea that the word in Hebrew is like the word for the Hebrews is a word for those who boundary cross.
The very first word for Jews, the very first word who boundary cross. That's the way the Torah describes us before we're ever referred to as Jews, referred to as Ivrim, the ones who cross over. Who, we're the ones who left, Lech Lecha, who went forth from all that we knew to a land that we didn't know. Then there's the question that you're asking of where does cannabis fit into the Jewish life, right? Dan and I were talking yesterday about contemporary Jewish life being so in need of experiential, some sort of experience, and not existing just from the neck up. I don't know if it would be so much of a modern take on Judaism and cannabis, because what Dan was referring to is a recent discovery in Tal Arad, in the Negev, in the desert in Israel. Actually, this temple was discovered, back in the 1960s, a long time ago. And they found basically a temple that very much mimics the temple that's in Jerusalem. A similar kind of Holy of Holies where the priests would go, and flanked on the side of the Holy of Holies were two pillars, where incense and some substances that we didn't actually know up until now were burned. And for a long time, they knew that there were substances that were burned on those pillars, but it wasn't until recently, as in a few weeks ago, that the science had evolved enough for us to use some sort of device to test and see what was on that pillar. And what they found out is that there was cannabis on the pillar, and not just any cannabis, but a cannabis that was testing relatively high in THC and CBN, which is another cannabinoid that's known for increasing the psychedelic and psychoactive component of cannabis. So, and it was mixed with dung as a way of burning it, and large amounts were being burned, and it was certainly being used and burned as a form of mind-altering substance for the priests and the people that were gathered there to experience. So you tell me. I mean, that sounds like the roots of our tradition. Imagine the drama of being a Jew 2,500 years ago at Tel Arad, where you brought you chipped in with your neighbor and you got a goat, and you went on a mission to bring with your neighbor, to go to this temple site, this holy site. You went on this adventure. You brought food with you, and you camped out, and you finally get up to this beautiful building that in the middle of the desert, and here's this massive compound. It just looks otherworldly, and the smell in the air is rich with frankincense. It's so rich with intensity. It does not mimic sitting in a synagogue hearing a rabbi call out page numbers, next to a pleasant tune. It just doesn't, to me, they're radically different experiences. So if anything, this, when I think about cannabis in the future of Jewish life, it almost seems like returning to a Jewish life that had more texture. Let me be the first to say, though, a disclaimer. Cannabis affects everyone differently. It really does. And while it may, for some people, help them medically, there's a lot of reasons we don't get. But for some people, even these kids with epilepsy, they use CBD oil and it's that they have no more seizures or significant decrease. And other kids, it does nothing for them. And some people, it takes away their pain, and other people, it does nothing. It can increase pain. And some of that's dose dependent and product dependent, but some of it's just our body chemistries are all different. So, Judaism in general is pretty amoral. It treats cannabis as it's just a thing. It's like money. It's what you do with it that can make it, helpful or not. So is it a tool? Is it a tool in Jewish life?
I like that question because it blurs like the descriptive voice and the prescriptive voice, right? Like there's a way in which is it a tool could be heard by somebody as, should it be a tool? Is this something is cannabis something that we should utilize? Or somebody could also hear it as like, is this a tool? Like, is this authentically part of the toolbox of Jewish tradition? And that links to where I wanted to go, because I'm glad you brought up that recent find with, okay, so we've got Israelites from a heck of a long time ago, thousands of years ago, that it appears were absolutely using cannabis for some kind. I mean, we don't know exactly for what purpose, but like it seems like for some kind of meaning making. What that brings me to is sort of my general reaction when there are whatever X, Y, or Z archaeological finds from thousands of years ago about anything, because there's two ways to go, right? And you started to hint at one of these ways. You talked about how, in a certain sense, this could be a return. This could be like utilizing cannabis today may not actually be some unprecedented thing in the arc of Jewish history to the extent that there is one arc, but like there's precedent for this. And I both really deeply understand why we would use that argument of precedent, and I like want to resist it. I don't want to say that the reason why cannabis is a tool in the toolbox today, or could be a tool in the toolbox today for Jews, for the world, for whatever, I don't want to say it's because it has been for a really long time. Because what that sets up is this paradigm that I think we're constantly living in Judaism, where we rely on having a past precedent in order for anything to be allowed. Like when we argue over and over again, Jewish meditation, we can find precedent for that 2,000 years ago. Well, can we really, in the sense that we're talking about today? Like, is mindfulness meditation in the 21st century West comparable to the kinds of things we can find that map to meditation a few thousand years ago? I'm not going to say there's no similarities, but is it really true to say that like we're returning to something, or are we just doing something new, which we should say is great? Because Judaism has been a thing that constantly creates new things, and only afterward do we pretend that they're not new, that they're continuations of before. Like, from my perspective, I want to say, like, okay, there are ways in which we understand cannabis deeper and understand applications of cannabis in a way that is powerful today. And so, like, Jews, but also humans, should be considering what this is for the world because of that. And okay, so it also was around a couple thousand years ago, and I think it's good to name that, because sometimes we think that the world is on this constant march towards, like, better. And if we were once at a better place on cannabis and then retreated to the Richard Nixon place of thinking it's terrible, like that disproves the idea that we're constantly on this arc towards the positive. But like, I wanted to name that there was like a button there. I know you weren't arguing against what I'm saying, but there was like a button in me that came up when we sort of anchor this new form of Jewish practice, because I do think that it's new, at least in the recent past, on past precedent. So I'm curious how you'd think about that with marijuana, but also more generally with new Jewish stuff as we sort of arc towards the close of the episode.
It's funny, you caught me still stuck in trying to, in this rabbinic pattern where like I have to connect everything back to once what was, for it to be authentic. That is such a dangerous thing, and I'm so glad you noted it. because it's like, what's the point of Judaism? Is it just to continue these traditions? Or are the traditions trying to get us somewhere? Are they trying to, what does it mean to be a nation of priests? What does it mean to be holy, to be a blessing, to seek, to walk humbly, to seek justice? What are all these? Judaism has developed this amazing toolbox throughout history. And maybe at one point cannabis was a tool, and maybe at one point it stopped being one. And we can go back and grab some, put it back in the toolbox. Or maybe we find new tools that are just as helpful or even much more at accomplishing the goal. And maybe we borrow them from other traditions. Maybe we develop them out of nothing. And at what point do those tools then become Jewish? That's an interesting question. I remember thinking when I was working at JESA, at the Jewish Social Service Agency, there's so many Jews that adopt. Does that mean adoption is a Jewish practice? When does it become Jewish? And there's so many Jews in cannabis. Does that mean cannabis is a Jew? It almost doesn't matter to me so much. What matters to me is it helpful? I'm thinking about Heschel, and Heschel, a contemporary philosopher who really focused on this concept of radical amazement, and that the purpose of Judaism was to acquire this mochin de gadlut, this expansive consciousness, as opposed to mochin de katnut, this narrow-minded thinking that we humans are prone to. If our goal is radical amazement, then does cannabis help me? It has in the past. At times, it really has. And there's other times where it's maybe been a bit of a numbing tool. And there's sometimes I need to be numbed. Prior to what was the Tel Arad discovery, archaeological discovery, the earliest known use of cannabis was 2,500 years ago. I think Tel Arad is 2,700 years ago. But 2,500 years ago, there's a Zoroastrian funeral and that where they can see evidence of cannabis being used by the mourners. And again, we don't know why, but it was likely being inhaled. And something to do with their healing or their expression of sadness. What is it trying to help us with? And maybe if we can figure out that, what's a Jewish answer? Like, what is Judaism trying to help us with? If cannabis is trying to help us do the same thing, then maybe it's Jewish. Maybe it's a Jewish tool, or maybe Jews can use it. And honestly, the language is someone else's battle. It's not mine. But look, cannabis is communal. I have had a lot of people ask me over the last few years, can we do a cannabis Havdalah? Can we do a cannabis Seder, which I've been to? There is a cannabis Haggadah for Passover. I'm down with all that stuff. I really am. But I haven't yet taken that on as part of my rabbinate. But I could see it being part of the future.
I would love to get a little bit of an understanding of your role as a rabbi in a non-traditionally rabbinic function, in a job where you are the head of corporate responsibility for a cannabis company, but it could easily be for any company. And it actually gets me wondering about the potential to see the role of a rabbi or some rabbi-like form of a future Jewish leader in roles that we don't typically think of as a rabbinic role or a Jewish role. But to me, that's a very narrow understanding of what Judaism is. And I actually love the idea that one gets trained in a certain Jewish way and then goes off into the world, bringing that Jewish, whatever we want to call it, into the world. It seems like that's the ultimate of what this might look like in the future. So I actually think that the idea that you are a rabbi or something that we might call another name in the future, that's what I'm advocating for, but something along those lines, and you're out in the world and we have thousands of people like that, would be a very fascinating future to me. So I would love it if you could just share a little bit about how your role as a rabbi is involved in the work that you do every day.
I remember leaving our very first executive retreat. It was Shabbos was coming, so and I told everyone I had to leave, and there's a lot of Jews there. They all smiled, and I think it was kind of just cute. But I thought, at the end of when I'm driving home, I was just struck by how much I had I think that my being a rabbi impacted the topics we talked about and the depth of conversation we had at the retreat. My work at JESA taught me that, at the social service agency, taught me that for a lot of people, their religiosity is expressed in getting up and going to work. Their work is an embodiment of how they try to make a difference in this world, how they try to serve and care for people. And so it's obvious with social workers, but it actually is true in a lot of other ways as well. And so having a rabbi in a corporation somehow opened the door for people to feel that this is holy work, and really connect that we're not just selling, anything here. We're selling something that tries to reduce suffering. We're selling a product that tries to connect people more deeply, that has the potential to. All of that talk, I think, happened because there was a rabbi in the room, and it was okay. We could talk about that. We could talk about what was happening in our lives in a deeper way, and we could talk about the work we do in a deeper way and how much we want to make a difference. And I just left thinking, you know what, maybe we should stick rabbis in every company. Maybe there could be other options out there, but for me, I still very much feel a connection, Dan, to the rabbi. I don't think it's a title I would easily give up. I think rabbinical school, though, it's a place where you discover what you believe in, and hopefully help other people discover. You learn to help other people discover what they believe in, and companies need that too. What do we believe in as a company? What do we stand for? What are we trying to do? We're spending 65 hours a week. Each of us are working tirelessly, for what? Just to get money? Well, what are we going to do with this money? So I don't know. I think I've been inspired by that. And I'm just interested in other ways, people who are rabbis or working in the community in non-traditional ways, and how that, it would be interesting to hear other people's experiences of where they feel their rabbinate impacts the work they're doing. You know what else is cool? It's nobody, because I'm not in a traditional rabbinic work. There's no lines I have to toe. I can come here and tell you religion's made up, that God's made up, that tradition is made up, that Torah is made up, and that something being made up isn't a bad thing. It frees you to make it up better.
Thank you so much for joining us. I love that closing sentiment of it allows us to make it up better. I hope that everybody listening really sits with that something being made up doesn't mean it's fake or artificial or superficial or nothing. It just means, wow, we get to participate in the making of it moving forward. So thank you so much, James, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation. We're going to be sitting with this one for a while.
I'm right with you. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you so much to all of you out there listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this conversation as much as we have, and we hope that you'll tune in the future. To close out the episode, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us in a variety of ways. First, there's our Facebook page. Actually, two Facebook pages, Judaism Unbound or Jewish Live. Jewish Live is all one word. There's our Twitter handle, which is just at Judaism Unbound. There is our website, judaismunbound.com, and our other website, jewishlive.org. And there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way, and you can do that via judaismunbound.com/donate or jewishlive.org/donate. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.